Is this the same shirt I wore in yesterday's short? Yes. Yes, it is. Hello, and welcome to another video. My name is Heather, and as always, I'm reading with a vengeance, and I hope you are as well. If you've been here before, as you know, I appreciate you. And if you're new to my channel, very warm welcome to you. I hope everybody is doing well. I am so excited to be recording today. I am, as you can tell, if you've been here before, in a new spot. I'm in an Airbnb, and I took all of my books that I have with me because I'm a crazy person, and I threw them all up on the shelf so that I can have a bookish background so that I can record. I thought I'd start off this video with just kind of a cozy little chat and a catch up to let you know where we are. So the last few videos were pre-recorded so that I could have time to travel and not worry about getting videos up. Not that I worry about it. I like to have kind of a good background. I like to just sit down and be in a relaxing environment. Plus, I didn't know how much I was going to get to read. And I really didn't, as far as word count goes, this was a low reading month for me. I actually ended up getting 11 books in this month, but that included a novella, a graphic novel, and a children's book. So as far as regular length books, I think there was only 7, but then again, I had one that was over 1,000 pages. We'll talk about that in this video as well. So where was I? So we left our fifth wheel in East Lyme, Connecticut on the 20th of January, I believe. And we stayed our first night just in New Haven. We didn't want to go too far because it was somewhat late when we got started. Then we drove the next morning for about 8 hours. We ended up staying in another hotel just outside of Richmond, Virginia. And just so you know, the way we were traveling, my husband was in his car, I was in my car. He had Jake, I had Zoe. So we were each traveling with our pups. Then the next morning, we drove another 7.5, 8 hours into Savannah. And if you missed my last video, that is where we have landed. My husband got a job in Savannah. This is where we're going to be, hopefully, staying for the long term. I'm super excited. I've never even been to Savannah, but we're super excited. I love the looks of it. I love the different nature aesthetic. There's like Spanish moss growing on all the trees that hang over the streets. Really, really beautiful. So I'm really looking forward to getting to know this city. I'm considering doing some vlogs. I have a bunch of little free libraries to check out. So I'll definitely be doing a little free library vlog, possibly more than one in the future. So that's where we're at. And once we got to Savannah, we stayed in an Airbnb, a condo closer to the coast for about 10 days. We wanted to extend, but we couldn't extend at that Airbnb. So we had to go to another Airbnb. So we're in the second Airbnb and we're closer to the center of Savannah proper, the center of town. So things kind of changed for us. We thought, and the whole reason we got the fifth wheel is we thought we were going to live in the fifth wheel for much longer than we did, because we thought we would buy a piece of land, live in the fifth wheel on the piece of land while we built a house. We had fun with living in the fifth wheel, and I won't go too far into it, but we just couldn't see living in it long term. It just wasn't for us. It was a fun little adventure, a fun little experiment, but long term, we just couldn't do it. So we have been house hunting. And on top of that, we had been, several weeks before we left, we had been looking for a campground to put the fifth wheel so we could at least stay in it when we first got here, and every place was booked. I called 11 places within like a driving range to my husband's job, and they're all booked. That kind of had a lot to do with how plans changed. So the fifth wheel's in storage. We haven't quite decided what we're going to do with that yet. But anyways, we've been house hunting and we are in the process. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to jinx it. Just send good vibes our way. Okay, so for now, we're in this Airbnb until for another few days, and then we're going into a short-term rental situation, a furnished house with a yard, which will be nice for the dogs. And we'll be in that place for at least a month, and hopefully only a month. see how it goes. We're in the process. So I will keep you updated on that. But it's been kind of a whirlwind, and reading has been, I just haven't been doing as much reading as I normally do. Because not only, it's not that I haven't had enough like downtime while my husband's at work or anything, but with everything going on, my mind's been kind of in a jumble. So it's been really hard to focus, really hard to concentrate. So I get my reading in when I can, but really, really short spurts. But what I have been doing is like listening to true crime podcasts, which I really love doing. I found a really good one. If you like true crime podcasts, there's a podcast called Suspect, and that had to do with the murder of a young woman up in Redmond, Washington. I found some really interesting stuff every time I listen to something like a podcast about real people, I like to like go online and look to see what they look like for whatever reason, just to get a visual in my head. And in doing that, I found out that the guy that was accused of murdering this woman spent 7 years, not in prison, but in county jail, just waiting for trial without ever being convicted. 7 years. Just so you know, county jail and prison, two entirely different animals. To spend that much time in the riffraff that is county jail, it's so chaotic and noisy, and there's people coming in and people leaving, and the stress of being in county jail is just a different type of stress than being in prison. I mean, it's both, you're in a cage in both places, but the environment is totally different. I'm not speaking from experience, if you're wondering. I've never spent time as a resident in a prison or a jail, but being in law enforcement, I just know the difference. So anyways, I don't know why I went on that tangent. Is that a cozy chat? I don't We found a couple of good shows to watch. We started watching The Mayor of Kingstown, which is really, really good. It's written by the same people who wrote Yellowstone, which we really love. And man, we binged that. We had one day where we didn't have any traveling to do, and we didn't really have anything to do. It was a Saturday, and it was raining. And I think we watched like 9 episodes. It's an hour-long show. And yeah, we binged the crap out of that one. It was really good. So that's the catch up, and that's where I've been. That's what I've been doing. Let's get to the book talk, shall we? I'm going to start with stats. I did a mid-month wrap-up, as I always do. And the books that I covered on my mid-month wrap-up, which I will link down below, were A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers, Your House Will Pay by Steph Cha, The Diamond Eye by Kate Quinn, The Wash Day Diaries by Jamila Rouser, and Us Against You by Frederick Backman. I didn't have any DNFs this month. Yay. Good way to start the year. Out of the 11 books, I read 6 women authors and 3 authors of color. 6 of the books were physical books, 2 digital books. This was the first month in a long time that I read off my tablet. And then 3 audiobooks, which is low for my normal number of audiobooks. Star ratings were really good, relatively good for the whole month. I didn't have anything below a 3-star. I had 2 3-stars, 4 3.5 stars, 2 4-star, 1 4.5-star, and 1 5-star. And if you watch my other video, my 5-star of the month was A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers, and I absolutely loved it. And I really hope it's more than a duology. If you haven't picked up this duology, please do. You don't have to be a lover of sci-fi. You don't have to be a lover of fantasy. You just have to have a soul, really. So I just realized I lied. I do have 1 rating that was below 3 stars. I do have a 2-star rating. I'm going to get this rant out of the way. So if you watch, you know that I did a TBR video, and I've come up with a new TBR system, and I'll link one of them down below so you can see. But it's basically kind of a random, I either roll dice or I have a little spinny spin wheel to make selections from my physical TBR, or this selection of lists of books that I have. What I do is I pick 5 books that I definitely will read in the mentioned month. They're not the only books that I'm going to read, but they're definitely 5. So the 5 books I picked for January, one of which was a category that was selected for me of the longest book on my TBR. And the longest book on my TBR was The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas. Alexander Dumas. That book is 1,400 pages long, at least the edition. I read this one digitally. 1,400 pages. I mean, you all have seen the book. It's big, no matter what edition. It's a classic. I've been thinking lately of doing a little research and doing a video of what makes a classic. I know there's other people who have done this video. To me, my experience has been what makes a classic is it had to have been written over 100 years ago. It uses language that nobody uses anymore. And I'm talking English, but it uses vernacular and a writing style that nobody uses anymore. And it's super, super long, often boring. Hate me, you can hate me, I understand. And I would too, but I can't help it. So the Count of Monte Cristo, the way I read it is I did some math. And at first I did wrong math because I'm me. And I thought I would be able to read 35 pages a day and finish it in January. I did that for about a week before I realized I did the math wrong. And I realized that I had to read 50 pages a day. Now, when I was reading 35 pages a day, it wasn't so bad. It actually started off really good and relatively easy to read for what we have. By the time I realized I had to read 50 pages a day, and I discovered that, I was like, okay, it can be done. I can do it. I've made a commitment. I'll do it. And by that point, it was getting towards a third of the book. It was getting a lot more dense and a lot more convoluted. I'm going to be honest, full disclosure here. I read, like truly read, about 650 to 700 pages before I wanted to put a fork in my eye. Then I had a discussion with myself of, am I going to DNF this book? And I didn't, not outright, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I made kind of a commitment with this TBR that I set for myself of 5 books that I was definitely going to read. Plus, it's a classic. I feel like DNFing a classic, I don't know. I'm not even sure. But the main reason I didn't DNF it is because I had invested myself in 700 pages of this book. And that's half the book. And when I say half the book, now if I was reading a 200-page book, DNFing at 50% is not that big of a deal. But when you DNF at 50% a 1,400-page book, that is a big deal. Its first 200 to 300 pages, I was having a good time with it. Because one of the things about this book is there's a lot of dialogue, which I find easier to read. And I really appreciate that. Throughout the whole book, there's a lot of dialogue. But the further you get into it, the more dense it gets, and it gets to be really, really difficult to read. And the first 200 to 300 pages of the book, there's a lot going on. And the part that everybody knows about, everybody knows it's a revenge story. Everything that everybody knows about it without reading it happens in the first 300 pages of the book. Edward Dante gets screwed over by 3 people who conspire to get him wrongfully imprisoned. He escapes, he becomes rich, and he spends his life exacting revenge on these 3 people. Yes. And that part of him, of the conspiracy, of him being imprisoned, what happens to him in prison, how he escapes, what he does when he escapes, how he becomes able to exact this revenge. Super engaging. I had a good time. But after that, how he goes about getting his revenge, there is a bunch of characters in this book that come into the story after Dante's escapes from prison. A bunch. And it goes off on all these different storylines that all kind of come together at the end. But, oh my God. And then you could read this whole book, just skim through the actual action of the story and just read the dialogue. You'll get everything that happens in the action part of the book, in the text of the book, because everything that happens is recounted in conversations that the characters have with each other. That makes the book twice as long as it needed to be. Here's what I did. When I got to about 700 pages, I decided to scan through the whole rest of the book, read all the dialogue, got a gist of what happened, and then what I did was I pulled up Spark Notes And I actually read not only the Spark Notes of the actual chapters of the actual book, but then the Spark Notes also has an analysis of each chapter, and I read that as well. You can judge me if you want. I consider this a finished book. I did what I could. I invested the appropriate amount of time. I spent a month reading this book. This was a struggle for me, and I gave it 2 stars. Now, it got 2 stars because it's a well thought out story. It got 2 stars because it is, I guess, well written, but it didn't get any more stars because I just don't like the writing style. It's very, very dense and very hard to understand at times. Also, I found that even though the dialogue was easier to read, I found that it was repetitive, like just the things they say back and forth to each other to make the same point. They'll go back and forth, and that was annoying. While I appreciate the story, it's the origin of the ultimate revenge story, I can't say that it's the best telling of it. And at the risk of sounding like a complete Philistine, I just think probably I would enjoy a retelling of it in a vernacular that is more up to date, more relatable to recent or current life. What can I say? So that was the longest on my TBR, at least it was. But the other book that was selected for my January TBR was Robinson Crusoe. As I was getting into this and as I was struggling with reading this, I'm like, oh my God, I don't know if I'm going to be able to read another classic in the month of January. And so I looked through Robinson Crusoe, and it's written in the same style, the same language, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it, and I wasn't going to put myself through it, and I wasn't going to start something only to want to DNF it and then struggle with myself. So not only did I put it in my stack of books to give away to a little free library, I mean, I took it off my TBR altogether. Not going to do it. Robinson Crusoe was the one and only of the 5 that I picked for myself that I did not read. So that's not bad. So enough about that. Let's get on to the good stuff, shall we? Oh, God. So listen, the idea that this is an unpopular opinion is not lost on me. So if you have opinions, I would love to hear about them. Please come at me. I want to definitely have conversations about this because, well, that's why I'm here. The next book I read in the second half of January was The Dead Kids Club by Rich Hosek. This one I picked for my TBR as the category was the highest rated on my Goodreads TBR. And that was this one. It's like 4.5 or something like that. And I had heard about this book from Lezlie over at the Nerdy Narrative. If you don't watch her channel, you absolutely must. She's a delight. I will link her channel down below. But she talked about this book on one of her videos, and I immediately added it to my TBR. So this was a fun ride. I enjoyed this one. This is a suspense. And this is told in the first person by a father. I don't know if he's ever named. Yeah, I can't remember if he's named, but he's a father. And in the very first couple pages, you know that his young son was killed by a drunk driver. He's already divorced from his wife, but this incident, unlike many incidences like it, actually brings them closer together. And his ex-wife, I believe her name is Rebecca. Rebecca brings up the idea of going after the man who kills their son because he was acquitted of it. He never had to serve any jail time. And he's the son of either a rich man or a mob man. I think he is connected to the mob. And so he gets off. And so Rebecca says, well, let's kill him ourselves. And they go after him. And the story goes from there. That what the Dead Kids Club refers to is that they are going to a support group where parents who have lost their children go to meet. It gets around that Rebecca and her husband go after the man who is responsible for their kid's death. And yeah, the story goes from there. So let me just say that both the narrator and Rebecca, to me, were not very likable. Rebecca kind of is bossy and manipulative and doesn't really treat her husband, her ex-husband, very well. And then I didn't like the narrator because he's kind of spineless and kind of allows himself to be walked all over by Rebecca. And so that just grated on me a little bit, but I got through it. The story itself, super fun. There needs to be a level of kind of a suspension of disbelief for this one. But if you're able to do that, it's a fun ride. It is a page turner. I read this fairly quickly. I want to say like 3 days. It is a suspense in the highest order. It is a fun ride. I gave it 3.5 stars. The writing is pretty simplistic. And in the same sense, it's super easy to read. Not a whole lot of character development, but enough to get you through the story. You know, it's one of those stories where you're like rooting for bad stuff to happen. You know, bad things should happen to bad people. It's kind of like a morbid fantasy novel. So, but at its core, it's a suspense, and it was super fun. Lots of gray morals here. But yeah, thanks, Lezlie, for the recommendation. Had a good time with it, and glad I read it. The next book I read in the second half of January was Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This one was not on my set TBR for January, but it finally became available on my Libby app. And so I did listen to this one. Long anticipated, super talked about when it came out. A lot of people's favorites, I think, of Taylor Jenkins Reid. I will tell you right now, it is my least favorite of Taylor Jenkins Reid. And I want to say I've read 4 or 5 of hers. Evelyn Hugo continues to be my favorite. And yes, I have read Daisy Jones. I'm glad I read it. This follows a family of 4 siblings, and they are the children of, is it Mick Rivas? I think his name is Mick Rivas, who was one of Evelyn Hugo's husbands. But anyways, these are the 4 kids of Mick Rivas. Riva? It's in the 80s, and they are close to each other. And this whole book is kind of surrounding this annual party that is thrown by the Rivas children. Everybody who's anybody attends this party. And the story kind of goes back and forth. You know, as you're following the day of the party, you start at 7 a.m. and it goes chronologically from 7 a.m. all the way through the night, through the party, the preparation for the party itself, something big that happens at the party, and what happens after the party. And then you flash back from that to the past, where you meet Mick Rivas and the children's mother, which I can't remember her name, but when they meet, fall in love, get married, have the kids, and how their relationship falls apart, how it affects the kids, and how that in turn kind of affects who the people, the 4 kids are now, and how it relates to this party. That is really the gist of the whole story. There's not really a plot per se. This is a family drama. It's very, I couldn't help but think to Apples Never Fall by Leanne Moriarty, also about 4 siblings. But there's a plot there. There's something that happens there. Whereas in this story, nothing really happens except for this party. Mick is estranged from his kids, and he kind of comes into the picture towards the end of the book. Stuff happens because of that. Here's what I did like about the book. It was super nostalgic for me because it takes place in the 80s, and I grew up in the 80s. So, you know, the references to the style of the 80s, the aesthetic of the 80s, I found very relatable. The surfing locations, I found very relatable because I've been to all those places. They mentioned Black's Beach, they mentioned Torrey Pines, they mentioned Sunset Cliffs, which, by the way, is where I had my very first apartment. So I really enjoyed that. While I didn't really connect with the characters, I enjoyed them. They were colorful characters. They each had personalities of their own, but there was just no solid plot to sink your teeth into. Definitely no twist of any kind. There was a twist in Evelyn Hugo. There might have been a slight twist in Daisy Jones. If there was, I don't remember. But there was no twist here. One thing I did find myself thinking about is another spin-off, because Kit is, I think, the youngest of the siblings, and I found her character to be the most interesting. She's dealing with sexuality, and she has these friends, Vanessa and Ricky, and stuff happens in that dynamic, and I found myself wanting to know more of that story. So, hey, Taylor, if you're watching, hi, how are you? If you can write a book that centers around Kit, I'd really like it. Thanks. And then finally, the one idea I really enjoyed in this book that I found super relatable, that touched my heart. Well, I'm just going to share with you this quote, and go from there. This quote, letting people love you and care for you is part of how you love and care for them. Now, this was super relatable to me because I'm super, super close with my mom. I'm an only child. She raised me as a single parent. We are super close. We talk every day. But the one point of contention in our relationship that I'll share with you is she wants to do so much for me. She wants to do things for me. She wants to send me money. She wants to buy me stuff. She wants to do stuff for me. She will make a 7-hour flight to come and help me move. She just wants to do everything for me. I think most of the time I'm appreciative of her, but over the years, we have gotten into like spats because I get annoyed. I'm like, stop doing things for me. Stop. You don't have to do this for me. I make my own money. I could do for myself. Do you know what I mean? And so I get annoyed with my mom. And I am just now starting to accept and be able to be okay with her doing things for me because that's how she shows her love for me. And as this quote says, I'm realizing the biggest way I can show love for my mom is letting her do the things that she loves to do for me. And so I really, really appreciated that moment in the book. So that was probably my favorite part of the whole book, and that's at the end. If you have plans to read this book, please continue with those plans. Don't let me dissuade you from reading this book. I still gave it 3 stars. I enjoyed it enough, and I think that has mostly to do with the fact that I loved Hugo so much that so far everything else has kind of paled in comparison. It's more of a me thing, but I think I can say and have a leg to stand on that this just didn't have a plot. So for that reason, I gave it 3 stars. The next book I read in the second half of January was My Darkest Prayer by S.A. Cosby. I was super excited to get to this. I'm going to hold this over here. When I read Razorblade Tears last spring, I want to say, and it quickly became one of my all-time favorite books, I immediately went on the hunt for My Darkest Prayer. Couldn't find it anywhere. I mean, I could have ordered it on Amazon. I try not to do that too much. But now that everybody is talking about S.A. Cosby, now that Razorblade Tears and Blacktop Wasteland has gained the popularity that it deserves, this was on a table front and center in Barnes & Noble. I was happy to see it there. I'm happy that he is getting all the love that he deserves. So anyways, when I saw this, snatched it right up, read it immediately. Now, spoiler alert, this is, out of the 3 S.A. Cosby books that there are, this is my least favorite. Now, that's not really saying much since Razorblade Tears tied for my favorite book of 2022 and one of my favorite books of all time. And Blacktop Wasteland was not far behind it. I think that was a 4 or 4.5 star book. But you can kind of tell that S.A. Cosby was just getting his writing legs, right, with writing this. Now, this isn't like his first time pen to paper. I think he's got a lot of published short stories in some magazines, some other publications. But you can tell that this was his first stab at a novel. And I think there's an author's note in here. I can't remember if it was in here or if it was an article that I read recently about his experience writing this book. I think it was an author's note in here. He talks about his struggle in writing a novel. And you could just tell, I really enjoyed this book. What is it about? So this follows Nate, I believe Nate Waymaker. Is it Nate? Yeah, Nathan, who is a former Marine. He's a former sheriff's deputy. He's kind of on a wayward path. He is living in a room at his cousin's church, just kind of living day to day. Doesn't really have any ambitions or goals in life. He's just kind of living day to day. Ooh, not church, funeral home. He lives in his cousin's funeral home, and he helps his cousin with picking up bodies and just kind of running day-to-day things at this funeral home. And then one day, a local preacher is found dead, and the circumstances of this death are shady, to say the least. And 2 of his parishioners come to Nathan to ask for help. They know that he's a former deputy. They just feel like the sheriff's department's not doing what they can or what they should to investigate this death. It's, I think, deemed as a suicide, and the ladies think that he was murdered. So they ask Nathan to ask questions, and he gets himself into some shit. And the story goes from there, and it's a good story. Nathan has an interesting background. Why he's no longer a sheriff's deputy is an interesting story. And there are all these other colorful characters in this story, and I had a good time with it. I like S.A. Cosby's way of writing dialogue, of how he colors his characters. I love his writing. Yes, I recommend it. I very much look forward to the new book that he's writing that's supposed to come out this summer. I will say that this one, while it does have some violence, it doesn't have nearly the violence that Razorblade Tears had. It has kind of a sexual vulgarity in this one. It stood out only because it didn't really show up in the other two books. And it just kind of, I don't know, it was a little jarring. Doesn't really color my overall thoughts of a book, but I will just point that out. But overall, I found the story very satisfying. It is my third favorite in the three, only because you can just kind of tell that he's finding his way through writing a novel with this one. I gave this one 3.5 stars. The next book I read was The Maid by Nita Prose. This one I listened to because it became available on my Libby app, and this one was super cute. This is a cozy mystery. This follows Molly, who is a maid for a pretty hoity-toity hotel. It is narrated from her perspective, and while it's not said outright in the book, it seems clear that Molly is neurodivergent. She's socially awkward. She doesn't pick up on social cues like most people do. And when a man who is kind of a big deal is found dead in the suite in the hotel, Molly gets herself into some trouble because of her straightforward ways, because of her trusting ways. Ultimately, she is named as a suspect. And the story goes from there. I did enjoy this one. I enjoyed the cozy mystery. The mystery itself is, I mean, you kind of see who the bad guy is from the get-go. I use the word mystery loosely. You are trying to find out how Molly's going to get out of the corner she has found herself backed into. Molly is super likable. She's super charming. You do get a little frustrated with her because she's super trusting when, you know, there would be red flags all over the place for most of us. She also talks a lot about her relationship with her gran, who she lived with for a long time, who helped her understand social cues and understand kind of the ways of the world. And her gran has passed away. It's been like several months, and Molly's making her way through the world on her own, just based on the lessons that she learned and from her gran, and she reflects on her relationship with her gran, which is super cute, super heartwarming. I really enjoyed that. The one thing that kind of bugged me about the story is there's a couple of choices that Molly makes. I won't say specifically what they are because I don't want to spoil it for you, but Molly's character is so well developed, I felt, which of course is a great thing about the story. And then she makes this particular choice that just doesn't feel right. I don't feel like the Molly that you get to know would have made this choice. If you know, you know. She does a favor for another character, but in order to do this favor, she had to be dishonest. And I don't think Molly would have done that. So that's splitting hairs, I know, but I'm trying to give good and bad here. So yeah, it was a cozy mystery. Super cute, super charming, super likable main character. I'd recommend it. I'm pretty sure this is a debut by the author, and so hopefully she goes up from here. And if she does, I mean, her future books I think are going to be really, really great, because this one was just adorable. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Finally, the last book I read in the month of January was James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. I picked this up at a little free library. I saw it at a little free library, and it got me all nostalgic because I was all about Roald Dahl when I was a kid. And when I saw this, and it's just a little guy, and I haven't read, a children's book in a really long time, and I thought I hadn't read it. And one of the reasons that I also thought I hadn't read it was the movie director Taika Waititi has a series on YouTube where he reads this book with like some other celebrities doing the characters, and it's awesome. If you haven't seen that, look it up. It's awesome. At least I listened to portions of it. I don't think I listened to the whole thing. I don't know. Life happens, and I didn't finish it. But in my mind, I thought, that I hadn't read this book. And then I looked up on Goodreads to select it as currently reading, and it had it. I rated it 3 stars. So at some point I did read it, or as soon as I started using Goodreads and I was going through books that I read as a kid that I wanted to mark as read, I don't know, I guess at some point I thought that I had read it, but I don't remember it. So I decided to read it again. It's only 118 pages or whatever, super easy read. I read in one sitting, and it's super cute. I gave it 3 stars again. Follows this young boy, James, who is, I think his parents have died, and he is sent to live with his 2 evil aunts. He's miserable, and he cries every day, and he's lonely. He's not allowed to play with anybody else, not allowed to do anything. And one day he meets a troll in the garden, and the troll gives him these magic gems. James drops the gems into the garden, and the nature, the insects and the trees and the bushes all are affected by these magic gems, and they grow super big. There's a peach tree back there. One of the peaches ingests one of the magic gems, grows to be really big, and James makes his way into the peach, and he meets a grasshopper, a ladybug, a spider, an earthworm, a light bug, and a silkworm. They're all living inside the peach, and they go on this adventure, and it's super cute. And I really hope I read this as a kid, because it is a great children's story. If you have kids, I would recommend this for them. But I gave it 3 stars because obviously I'm not the audience. You know, it's a very simple story. It is super nostalgic to my childhood. I know I did read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and so I'm glad I read it. And it was a nice little palate cleanser for the other dark stuff that I read this month. So yeah, 3 stars. So that is it. Those are the books that I read in the month of January. Pretty good start to the year, I think. How about you? How's your reading year started off so far? Did you guys have a good January? Please let me know if you read any doozies. If you think that I would like them, I would love to hear about them. Or you can just say hi down in the doodly-doo. If you're still watching at this point, please consider giving that like button a boop, and a subscribe would be wonderful. I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.